Here we go. Um, just as good coaches analyze the opposition carefully before choosing the best game plan, good writers analyze the audience for exactly the same reasons. You have to choose the right game plan for each audience. And having a big playbook really helps because you're not always playing the same team. So sorry to stretch the sports metaphor so far, but here's what I'm talking about. Everything that I've taught you so far in this class is about the classical thesis. And you use that when you're facing a skeptical audience. And that's what an academic audience is. We're professional skeptics. You can convince me in a research paper or an essay that you've done your homework and that you've presented your evidence. But I'm going to start out by saying, well, prove it to me. So you state your thesis immediately in the first paragraph when you're presenting to a skeptical audience, to an academic audience. Then you present your step-by-step evidence to defend it. And notice this is exactly what we do in the Friday, Saturday test. This is exactly what we do in the longer essays. That's why I keep, just emphasizing, maybe overemphasizing. I don't think so. I emphasize over and again that that's the way we do it. And nothing I'm about to say changes that because when you're writing for an academic audience, that's the way it is. All right? But what about if you're not writing for an academic audience? For example, what if you're writing for a hostile audience? And by hostile, I mean they're not willing to be convinced, and they're going to hate it no matter what you say. And I'm going to use the example that from my own real life as an activist. If you're going to go talk to climate deniers about climate change, or if you're going to talk to haters about LGBTQ rights, and I do both of these kinds of advocacy in my real life, then if you use the classic method and you state your thesis up front, they'll just decide to hate on you right away. So what you need to do instead is first to build trust, shared values, then come at them from the surprising new angle at the end. This is what I would describe as outflanking your enemy or making friends with your enemy first. So if you use the classical thesis, they'll just start throwing tomatoes at you or shut down or stop listening from the moment you open your mouth because they'll think, well, this is an idiot and I don't believe what he says. But if you use what I call the sneak attack thesis and throw it in at the end, you have a little chance of survival. And by the way, what if it's an angry audience? And these are all my definitions, but I've faced these kinds of audiences. An angry audience won't just shut down or decide not to listen. They will actually attack you, and hopefully it's just a verbal attack, but in some cases in my life, it's actually been physical attacks. So in this case, I think I would recommend what I call the Trojan horse thesis. I wouldn't ever tell them directly what it is I'm trying to say. I would kind of pretend to surrender, rely on flattery, concession, implied logic, innuendo to infiltrate their mental defenses and flip their arguments off balance. So in this third way, you don't even state your thesis at all. In the first form, you state your thesis right up front in an academic essay because the audience is skeptical and just needs to be won over. In the sneak attack thesis with a hostile audience, maybe you sneak your thesis in at the very end after you've built some trust. Maybe some people might listen to you then. With the angry audience, you never state the thesis directly at all. You just kind of hint at it and then slide out the door before you get attacked. Now, there are other audiences. What if you have the complete opposite from the hostile, angry audience, which is the friendly audience? These are people who are already on your side. In my case, that would be, climate advocates and communicators just like me, or LGBTQ rights advocates just like me. And of course, if I go step by step proving that LGBTQ people are deserving of equality and full citizenship and the right to marry and the right to adopt children and that love is love, I'd be preaching to the choir. And if I start trying to convince climate advocates that climate change is real, I'm wasting their time and mine. So instead, if you're facing a friendly audience who already believes what you're preaching, then your job is to get the troops fired up. This is like the locker room speech from the coach. Of course your team wants to win. What they need to get is fired up, or like the politician who's talking to his or her own staff. Get out there and get those voters fired up. You can also use other variations. A question thesis works really well with a curious audience. And I also think this is increasingly sort of the TED Talk thesis, where we're going to investigate something together, but the presenter in a TED Talk doesn't always tell you right away what the answer is. They tell you what the question is, and then they investigate the question with you. Now, if your audience is a curious audience, this works great, and that's why people go to TED Talks, because they want to be entertained and delighted, right? That's why, that's why people love TED Talks. But again, a TED Talk is not the same as an academic essay, and it's certainly not the same as talking to a hostile or angry audience. So great if you've learned how to do TED Talks, but make sure that you're choosing the right audience. A middle-of-the-road thesis is what we used to do before we got all politically polarized, and that's where you'd say, hey, those extremists on this side of the political spectrum, this is what they think, and of course that's not right. And then you'd say, oh, those people over here on the other side of the way over on the far end of the other political spectrum, they can't be right, that's too extreme. And here I am, the centrist politician or the centrist presenter in any argument, saying that the middle of the road is the way to go. Unfortunately, these days the joke is that the only thing in the middle of the road is roadkill, and a dumb yellow line. So you may have to use other kinds of thesis statements with our crazy new polarized audiences now. The think outside the box thesis can be incredible. This is another one you see in TED Talks. If you have an out-of-the-box amazing thesis, an amazing point of view, an amazing solution that no one's ever thought of, hooray for you, that examines everything from a new angle. The problem is you got to think of it, and then you have to get people to take it seriously. I kind of like the old wisdom that the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think that's an old Carl Sagan saying, but it's true. So it's a wonderful thing if you have a think outside the box thesis, but even once you've thought of it, convincing anybody else that it's true can be really hard. So it doesn't necessarily make things easy. A narrative thesis is beautiful, and of course this is another thing you hear in TED Talks and political speeches all the time. Instead of debating Medicare, let me tell you about my grandma and how she almost passed away and was saved by this or that. The TED Talk person will tell you how they came to their wonderful discoveries or revelations. And it is a very natural way to present a thesis. So it can be done, and people love stories. The problem in an academic environment is that stories aren't evidence. Anecdotes aren't evidence. Evidence is evidence. So we need a more logical kind of presentation, or at least after you have a narrative introduction, a more logical kind of presentation in an academic essay. But with other audiences, it works fantastically well. A comparison thesis is a great thing. This is also known as argument by analogy. This is a very slippery way to argue. For example, if I could get you to think that, if I could get you to accept the analogy, and I know some of you won't, but if I could get you to accept the analogy that licensing guns is just like licensing cars, then I would already have you 90% of the way down the road, so to speak, to thinking that maybe licensing gun owners isn't such a bad idea, as they do in many countries. And again, you don't have to accept that argument. You have to see that that was the style of argument that I was using. And you can use it on the other side too. You just have to come up with a different analogy. And then finally, there's what I would call a paradoxical thesis, which is embracing extremes. And maybe this is the one we need in our new polarized environment. I think Marshall actually tries for this in his Don't Even Think About It, where he says, those people way over there on that end of the political spectrum, they have a point. And those people way over here on the other end, they have a point. So instead of rejecting the extremes, you embrace the extremes. The tricky point, of course, is that you've got to come up with a way to meld them simultaneously. But if you can do that, it is extraordinarily powerful. And I think, for example, in his chapter, whatever it is, chapter 40, Marshall tries to do that by saying that religion and religious discourse has to be part of making climate change a truly global cause that everyone will embrace and will perhaps help us move beyond our current state of massive polarization. All right, I'd love to see you try some of these in your next essay, but remember, I know I've said it over and over again, but remember that for an academic audience, the thesis goes on the front page. Thanks.